Across the nation, there are hundreds of thousands of religious congregations. And as Lisa Desjardins reports, some of the biggest, known as megachurches, are facing challenges as the culture around organized religion changes.
Across America, something once thought unshakable is starting to change. Megachurches that once filled stadium-sized sanctuaries are now facing shrinking crowds, rising debt, and uncertain futures. From iconic ministries to massive church campuses, signs of decline are becoming harder to ignore. But how did institutions built for unstoppable growth reach this point so quickly? And is it really possible that half of America's megachurches could disappear by 2026? The answers reveal a shift few saw coming, the collapse that's already happening. Something unusual is happening inside America's most famous megachurches, and it's not happening quietly anymore. For years, these churches were seen as unstoppable forces, growing year after year, filling massive auditoriums and expanding into multi-million-dollar campuses. But today, that image is starting to crack in ways that are hard to ignore. Take Willow Creek, once considered a blueprint for modern megachurch growth. At its peak, it wasn't just a church. It was a destination, a place with thousands of seats filled every weekend, leadership conferences drawing global attention, and facilities that looked more like a corporate campus than a traditional church. Yet now, parts of that same system sit noticeably quieter, a shadow of what they once were. The question is no longer how big it became, but how quickly it changed. And Willow Creek is not alone. Across the United States, massive church buildings that once symbolized success are now being sold, repurposed, or left struggling under financial pressure. Some are turning into warehouses, event centers, or commercial properties. Others are simply sitting half-empty, their original purpose no longer matching reality. The decline becomes even more alarming when you look at the numbers behind the names. Harvest Bible Chapel in Chicago, for example, filed for bankruptcy after accumulating tens of millions in debt. Attendance reportedly fell from over 10,000 members to just a fraction of that in only a few years. The Crystal Cathedral in California, once a global symbol of televised worship, was eventually sold after financial collapse and later purchased by the Catholic Church. Mars Hill Church in Seattle, which expanded rapidly across multiple campuses, shut down completely in a matter of months after leadership controversies and internal breakdown. These are not isolated stories. They are part of a repeating pattern. And here's where it becomes even more striking. Across the broader megachurch landscape, attendance has been declining, donations are tightening, and financial pressure is building. Many churches that once thrived on expansion are now facing the opposite challenge: contraction. Buildings designed for thousands now host only hundreds. Debt that once felt manageable during growth is now becoming overwhelming in decline. But this didn't start overnight. To understand what's happening now, you have to look back at how fast everything grew in the first place. Because just a few decades ago, megachurches were expanding at an almost unbelievable rate. What started as a handful of large congregations slowly turned into a nationwide movement. Bigger campuses meant bigger crowds. Bigger crowds meant bigger budgets. And bigger budgets fueled even more expansion. It looked like an unstoppable cycle, until it wasn't. And now, that same system is starting to reverse. What once looked like a story of endless growth is beginning to resemble something else entirely. A system under pressure, a model struggling to hold its own weight. And in some cases, an institution realizing too late that growth was never guaranteed to last. But the most important question isn't what is collapsing. It's what built it in the first place, and why it grew so fast without anyone questioning how long it could actually last. And that story begins with the rise of the megachurch empire itself. The golden age of megachurch expansion. Before the decline, there was a period when everything seemed to be moving in only one direction: up. For nearly 3 decades, megachurches in America experienced a kind of expansion that felt almost unstoppable. What began as large congregations slowly transformed into full-scale religious enterprises. Not just places of worship, but campuses with cafes, bookstores, theaters, gyms, and auditoriums that could rival concert venues. It wasn't just growth. It was reinvention. In the early 1990s, there were only a few hundred megachurches in the United States. By the early 2000s, that number had roughly doubled. By 2020, estimates placed it at over 1,000 nationwide. Each year seemed to bring larger buildings, more attendees, and increasingly ambitious projects. The formula appeared simple: build bigger, attract more people, and the system sustains itself. And for a while, it worked almost perfectly. Pastors became recognizable public figures. Some had television broadcasts, best-selling books, and global speaking tours. Their messages reached millions far beyond Sunday services. Churches were no longer just local institutions, they were brands. Take Houston's Lakewood Church, for example, which transformed a former sports arena into one of the largest worship spaces in the country. It became a symbol of how far modern church growth could go. In other cities, similar transformations were happening. Massive sanctuaries, advanced sound systems, stage lighting, and production teams that made Sunday services feel closer to a live event than a traditional gathering. Behind the scenes, however, this growth required serious financial backing. Between the late 1990s and 2010s, megachurches across the United States accumulated billions of dollars in construction-related debt. Reports estimate that combined borrowing for facilities, expansion projects, and operational scaling reached several $billion during this period. Loans were taken for land, buildings, parking structures, and increasingly complex campuses designed to handle thousands of attendees at once. And banks were willing to lend. Why? Because the numbers looked stable. Attendance kept rising, donations kept flowing, and every expansion seemed justified by the previous success. It created a feedback loop. Growth justified debt, and debt fueled more growth. But there was another layer to this expansion that wasn't always visible from the outside. Much of the system relied heavily on personality. Charismatic leaders were often the central force behind entire organizations. Their vision, communication style, and public presence became the foundation of growth. In many cases, the church's identity was deeply tied to a single individual. As long as that leader remained in place, everything held together. But that structure carried a hidden vulnerability, because when a system depends too heavily on one person, it becomes powerful in growth, but fragile in crisis. And history eventually began to show what happens when that fragile balance breaks. In the years that followed, several high-profile megachurch leaders became involved in controversies, internal conflicts, or public scandals. Some resigned under pressure. Others stepped down after investigations or allegations surfaced. And when they did, something consistent began to happen. Entire congregations didn't just shrink. Some collapsed almost overnight. That shift revealed a deeper issue beneath the expansion era. The system was never just about buildings or attendance. It was about trust placed in leadership structures that were never designed to be easily replaced. And once that trust started to fracture, the consequences became impossible to ignore. In the next phase, those cracks would widen even further, not just through leadership failures, but through scandals that would shake the entire foundation of the megachurch world. The scandals that shattered trust. At first, the cracks in the megachurch world were easy to dismiss. A controversy here, a leadership dispute there, nothing that seemed strong enough to shake entire institutions. But over time, the stories stopped looking like isolated incidents. A pattern began to emerge, and it wasn't just about money or growth anymore. It was about trust. And once trust begins to break inside a faith-based system, everything else starts to follow. One of the most well-known examples is Mars Hill Church in Seattle. It began as a small Bible study and grew rapidly into a multi-campus megachurch with thousands of members across several states. Its lead pastor, Mark Driscoll, became one of the most influential and controversial voices in modern evangelical circles. But behind the rapid expansion were growing reports of internal conflict, allegations of abusive leadership, and misuse of influence. When leadership tensions reached a breaking point, Driscoll eventually stepped down in 2014. What followed was not a gradual decline. It was a rapid unraveling. Within months, all campuses were closed, and the entire organization dissolved. A structure built over years disappeared in what felt like moments. A similar pattern unfolded elsewhere. At Harvest Bible Chapel in Illinois, founder James MacDonald built a large ministry presence that included multiple campuses and media platforms. But investigations and internal reports later revealed financial irregularities and leadership concerns. He was eventually removed, and the church experienced a dramatic drop in attendance and influence shortly after. Then came Willow Creek, once considered a model for modern church growth. In 2018, founder Bill Hybels stepped down following allegations of misconduct spanning years. The fallout didn't just affect leadership, it shook the confidence of thousands of members and raised deeper questions about accountability within large church systems. Hillsong Church also faced global scrutiny when one of its prominent pastors, Carl Lentz, was removed following revelations of moral and leadership failures. Given Hillsong's global reach and celebrity connections, the impact extended far beyond a single congregation. It became a worldwide conversation about power, image, and accountability in modern churches. And these cases are not alone. Investigations within major church networks, including reports tied to large evangelical organizations such as the Southern Baptist Convention, have revealed long-standing concerns about how allegations of misconduct were handled, or in some cases, ignored. Each revelation added another layer of doubt for congregations already beginning to question what was happening behind the scenes. What makes these situations especially significant is not just the scandals themselves, but the structure that allowed them to escalate. Many megachurches operate with limited external oversight. Leadership boards are often internally selected. Financial transparency varies widely, and accountability systems differ from traditional denominational structures. In environments like this, influence can become concentrated at the top, and when that influence is misused, the effects ripple across entire communities. For many attendees, these revelations created a turning point. People who once trusted without question began to look closer. Donations slowed. Attendance became inconsistent. And for some, faith in the institution began to separate from faith itself. Because once the image of stability is disrupted, it becomes difficult to restore. And just as trust was beginning to fracture at a leadership level, an entirely different force arrived. One that didn't target individuals, but the entire system itself. A global disruption was coming that would push already fragile churches to their limits, expose financial weaknesses, and permanently change how people engage with religion. That disruption would arrive in the form of a crisis no one was prepared for. The crisis that exposed everything. For years, megachurches operated under a quiet assumption. Even if challenges came, the system itself would hold. Attendance might fluctuate, scandals might surface, but Sunday services would continue filling seats, and donations would keep the structure alive. Then everything stopped. When the global pandemic hit in 2020, churches across America were forced to shut their doors almost overnight. Massive auditoriums that once held thousands were suddenly empty. Services moved online. Pastors preached into cameras instead of packed sanctuaries. At first, it seemed like a temporary disruption, something the system would easily recover from once normal life returned. But what followed was far more revealing. When in-person gatherings resumed, many churches expected a full return. Instead, a significant portion of attendees never came back. Estimates varied by region and denomination, but many large congregations reported that only around 60 to 70% of their previous attendance returned consistently. The missing percentage wasn't random. It was heavily concentrated among younger families and irregular attendees. And that changed everything, because megachurches were not built for partial capacity. Their entire model depended on scale, large crowds, high engagement, and consistent weekly participation. When attendance dropped, the financial structure immediately felt the pressure. Weekly giving declined. Fixed costs did not. Behind the scenes, the numbers were becoming difficult to ignore. Massive campuses still carried mortgages, maintenance costs, staffing expenses, utility bills, and production budgets designed for full-scale attendance. But the income no longer matched the infrastructure. Some churches began cutting programs. Others closed satellite campuses. A few entered restructuring phases, trying to stabilize finances that were once dependent on constant growth. But the financial strain was only part of the story. The shift also changed how people viewed church itself. During lockdowns, millions of people experienced something new: worship from home. At first, it was a substitute, but over time, it became a preference for some. People began to question why they needed to attend massive physical gatherings when digital access was easier, more flexible, and less time-consuming. At the same time, something else happened. Transparency increased. With more people online, information became easier to access. Pastors' salaries, building costs, property values, and church budgets were no longer hidden behind closed doors. People started researching where their donations were going. And for many, what they discovered created discomfort. Large portions of church budgets were tied to buildings, staff salaries, loans, and operational costs. While ministries and outreach programs existed, they often represented a smaller percentage of total spending than expected. That gap between perception and reality began to reshape trust. And then came another pressure point: generational change. Younger audiences, especially millennials and Gen Z, were already shifting away from traditional institutions. The crisis accelerated that trend. Many younger attendees began to question not just where churches met, but how they were structured, who made decisions, and whether those systems reflected genuine accountability. As restrictions lifted, the contrast became clear. Some people returned eagerly to large gatherings. Others didn't return at all, not because they stopped believing, but because they stopped feeling connected to the model itself. And while megachurches struggled to regain their previous momentum, a deeper shift was quietly taking shape underneath the surface. Because the crisis didn't just interrupt attendance, it exposed the fragility of a system built on constant scale, constant growth, and constant participation. And once that illusion of stability broke, a bigger question emerged. What happens to a system designed for expansion when expansion itself is no longer guaranteed? That question now leads directly into what is happening next: the slow emergence of a very different kind of church, and a very different kind of faith experience altogether. The end of the megachurch era and what comes next. If the past decades were defined by expansion, spectacle, and scale, what is emerging now feels like the complete opposite. Across America, the question is no longer how big churches can become, but whether the current model can survive at all. Because something subtle but powerful is happening beneath the surface, people are not just leaving churches. They are changing what they expect from them. One of the clearest shifts is happening in demographics. Religious affiliation in the United States has been steadily declining for years, especially among younger generations. Surveys from organizations like Pew Research Center show that the percentage of Americans identifying as religiously unaffiliated has grown significantly over the past 2 decades, with younger adults leading the shift away from traditional institutions. But this does not always mean people are abandoning belief itself. In fact, many still believe in God or spiritual ideas. What they are rejecting is the structure, especially large institution-heavy models like megachurches. The preference is shifting away from massive Sunday gatherings and towards smaller, more personal, and more flexible expressions of community. This is where things become even more interesting. While megachurches struggle to maintain attendance and funding, smaller congregations, often in the range of 200 to 800 members, are showing signs of stability and even modest growth. These communities may lack the scale and production of megachurches, but they often offer something the larger systems struggle to provide: intimacy, accessibility, and direct relationships. At the same time, another unexpected movement is growing in the opposite direction of modern megachurch culture. Younger generations, particularly Gen Z, are showing renewed interest in traditional and liturgical forms of Christianity, Catholic, Orthodox, and Anglican practices. These traditions emphasize history, structure, ritual, and continuity. For many young believers, the appeal is not innovation, but rootedness. Not entertainment, but meaning. This shift is subtle, but it challenges the very foundation of the megachurch model, which was built on modernization, adaptation, and experience-driven services. Some church leaders have already begun adjusting. Instead of centralizing massive congregations, they are breaking into smaller, decentralized communities spread across cities. Multi-site models are being restructured. Large campuses are being downsized or repurposed. The focus is slowly moving away from spectacle and towards sustainability. But not every institution is adapting in time. Some megachurches remain burdened by debt, aging infrastructure, and declining attendance. Others are still trying to maintain the same model that worked decades ago, even as the environment around them has fundamentally changed. The gap between cost and capacity continues to widen. And yet, within this uncertainty, something unexpected is emerging. In smaller settings, living rooms, rented spaces, coffee shops, and modest chapels, communities are forming that look nothing like the megachurch era. There are no massive stages, no production teams, no arena-style seating. Just small groups of people gathering with a shared desire for connection, meaning, and faith without spectacle. Even within larger institutions, leaders are beginning to acknowledge that the old assumptions no longer hold. Growth is not guaranteed. Attendance is not automatic. And influence is no longer tied to size, which leads to the final realization. The megachurch era was never just about buildings or budgets. It was about a belief in endless expansion, an idea that bigger always meant better, and that growth would never stop. That belief is now being tested in real time. Some churches will adapt. Some will shrink. Others may disappear entirely, their buildings repurposed or abandoned, their legacy left behind in empty seats and fading signs. But what replaces them is still being written. And the most important question is no longer whether the megachurch model is ending. It's what kind of faith will rise in its place when the age of spectacle finally comes to a close. Thanks for watching. If this made you think differently about megachurches, don't forget to subscribe for more deep stories like this. Drop your thoughts in the comments below.